Hi, my name's Phil. I like talking about politics, and in this video I'd like to take a look at the newly resurfaced account from the UK's chief Brexit negotiator, David Frost, in which he stated quite clearly that it would be Britain that would need to blink in order to get trade deals around the world after Brexit. But first, if you'd like to be notified of daily news and politics, please subscribe to the channel and click the bell notification icon. So, David Frost, this is the man who was appointed by Boris Johnson to be the unelected bureaucrat who manages our Brexit EU negotiations, because he was a very handy yes man. And he was writing with a very different line in 2016 as compared to the one he now toes that takes its lead from the government. The Financial Times has recently drawn attention to a pamphlet that he contributed to, which was published after the referendum and concerned, so what do we do post-Brexit? Now, amongst other things, it contained a load of stuff from Michael Gove, which, when you read it now, looks like a load of lies. Who'd have thought that? And a piece from David Frost on our prospects for free trade outside the EU. Now, this was one of the selling points of Brexit for a lot of people. We'll be able to get, yes, I know we have free trade with the EU, but we'll be able to get free trade with a much greater proportion of the globe. And Frost was contributing as someone who had trade negotiating experience. He wrote a number of interesting things in it that goes completely against the line he's been pushing since deciding that the rewards for selling out your country are pretty handsome when there's a Conservative government in town. So back in 2016, he was explaining, for example, the trade-offs with trade policy. So he said, well, if you're willing to sacrifice your trade policy, then of course you can have completely free trade with another's market. You know, no tariffs, no paperwork, no barriers, which is, of course, what we've become used to as EU members. He says, but if you want to have your own trade policy, then you're obviously going to have different systems in place to the other market. And this is the fundamental aspect of Brexit trade that has been continually denied by the Leave supporters. If you want your own rules, by definition, your rules are going to be different to others. I mean, that's the point of having your own rules, isn't it? And if your rules are different to others, then that also means they're not going to be compatible. Again, by definition, that's what you want, isn't it? You want rules that aren't compatible. So if your rules aren't compatible with, for example, the EU single market rules, then you don't get free access to the EU single market. In fact, you don't get completely free access to any market, because it doesn't matter which market you point at. If you're not going to have compatible rules, you can't have free access to that market. You've got to completely mimic their rules to do so. And if you do that, you know, if you copy the rules from somewhere else, well, then you don't have an independent trade policy, do you? You know, an independent trade policy means higher costs, more bureaucracy, more barriers. This is why it's exactly what we're getting. You know, despite what the Brexit government kept saying and all bafflingly keep trying to say to some people, that is exactly what we're getting. We can see this now. You know, this is why we're having to employ tens of thousands of extra bureaucrats to deal with all the paperwork. You know, the Brexiteers kept trying to say, oh, there's so much bureaucracy in the EU. No, there isn't. The purpose of the EU is to reduce bureaucracy. So after Brexit, we are now going to have more bureaucrats in the UK than the whole EU has. You know, for the whole EU Commission. Just to deal with Brexit, by the way. That doesn't even include the bureaucrats that we need for other things. You know, the British businesses are now going to have to face the extra costs of not only tariffs, but also having to fill in all the time-consuming and complex paperwork. It's why we're going to be experiencing severe disruption at our borders, miles-long queues of, you know, lorries, that sort of thing. And although, you know, that aspect of it is being made worse by our lack of preparation, even when the systems are fully in place, which is going to be some years, but even then, there will still be delays, because wherever you've got divergent rules between two markets, you have delays at those borders. And it could never be any different. And Frost even went further in this pamphlet. He said you'd not only get rid of these barriers to trade, but that every time that one side changed their rules, you'd create another barrier at the same time. So you're already going to have trade barriers with Brexit. Every time either the UK or the EU changes a rule, you create a new barrier, because that's another thing that's... unless you change a rule to be compatible with the other side, but that's not how divergence works. So when we look at the situation we're facing right now, businesses in the UK and the EU as well, to an extent, don't really understand the rules just yet. And that's not because they've been complacent. Some may have been because they've listened to the Brexiteer government telling them it's no problem. But it's partly down to the whole mess of rules changes taking place overnight. But also because we don't know the full rule set yet, because there is still the possibility of some sort of deal. If we arrange a deal, well, there'll be some rules that won't be in place if we don't have a deal, for example. So the rules are yet to be determined. But there is also going to be that sudden massive change in the rules overnight. But even when that settles down, you could imagine a time in a few years where that's settled down and businesses are now used to those rules and whatever. Again, whenever either the UK or the EU changes a rule, as you do, this is what parliaments do, they change rules, that's their purpose. The way businesses trade between the UK and the EU changes again, because there'll be some new rule now. And that adds an extra amount of work that those businesses will have to do to keep up to date with these new rules that will never go away. And it will affect British businesses disproportionately, of course, because there's a much higher proportion of British businesses that trade with the EU than EU ones that trade with the UK. That's just down to the comparative size of the two. And then there was this double-page spread where he wrote, can any of these be economically better for Britain? Talking about the different potential paths we could take. Can any of these be economically better for Britain? It's fairly easy to answer, to see that the answer must be no. No was in fairly large letters. And it was and is that simple. People could try and deny it then, and indeed did. But let's look at the situation now. So ask those Brexiteers back then where we'd be 10 months after leaving the EU, and they would tell you we'd have signed a whole raft of trade agreements around the world on better terms than we had as EU members. That's not me putting words into their mouths. They said that that would happen the day after we left. But what has actually happened? You know, we've signed carryover deals, sure, with certain countries, amounting to about a tenth of our trade. These are deals on exactly the same terms as our arrangements with the EU, so they're not better. They could arguably be a little bit worse because they're not as comprehensive and don't include all the players. They may not be as good if rules of origin issues crop up, for example. But in theory, they're on the same level. In addition, the only trade agreement that we've arranged that is materially different to the EU agreement equivalents is with Japan. And the people who arranged that in the civil service were complaining. They didn't want to conclude the trade deal this year because, as it was, they've said it's 17% in favour of the UK, 83% in favour of Japan. Liz Truss, who is the cabinet minister who forced the conclusion of that trade agreement in Japan's favour, she was asked in Parliament last week to name just one aspect of it that is better than we have now in the transition period. In other words, name me one aspect of this deal that is better than the EU-Japan trade deal. She wasn't able to answer. Now, some people may say, but when they announced this deal, the government said that it was better in various respects. Read the detail here, the fine print. They were comparing the Japanese trade deal with the arrangements between the EU and Japan before the EU and Japan agreed a trade deal. So it wasn't comparing to what we have now. It was comparing to what we had some years ago. Now, that bit was a surprise even to me, I have to confess, because I expected at least one or two things that would be clear improvements, even if the net effect was still negative for us, in order to sell it. Because at some point, the details are going to emerge. But Truss couldn't name a single improvement. She couldn't name a single part of this deal that was better. The government's own figures suggest that it's worth less to our economy than the current EU-Japan deal as well. So we have a carryover deal. We actually have a number of carryover deals with some decent economies like Switzerland. Now Canada, they've finally got that over the line. and South Korea. A number of very small economies as well, like, you know, Faroe Islands, Liechtenstein, that sort of thing. We have a worse deal with a major economy, Japan. And we're still trying to get deals with the EU and the US, with whom we have about 3/4 of our trade and who own half the world's wealth. Now, the reality of our post-Brexit trade is a world away from what the Brexiteers said would happen, and exactly in line with what our now chief Brexit negotiator was saying in 2016. Now, in terms of negotiating realities, he had this to say in the pamphlet. It will be Britain that has to make the concessions to get the deal. True, other countries will want deals too, but they won't be under anything like the same time pressure and can afford to make us sweat. And then something that made me almost laugh out loud. Trade negotiations are complex, and a good modern trade agreement requires many stakeholders within a country to be involved in the negotiations and be ready to implement the result. This is why negotiations take years and not months. Now, some people will point out, but we did arrange our trade deal with Japan in months, not years. Indeed we did. Now compare with what happened with that Frost statement. We did it specifically by not including those stakeholders, including our own parliament. Almost nobody was involved from our point of view, from Japan's point of view. From our point of view, almost nobody was involved. The details are still fairly secret, and it's doubtful that many businesses are in a position to implement the results because, well, they don't know the full details of what that result is, much less took any part in negotiating it. And this is the intended pattern for all trade agreements. Carry them on as secretly as possible, exclude as many stakeholders as possible, and thereby get a deal that is just as bad for us as the Japanese trade deal was. Note that Japan put pressure on the UK to sign what was for us unsuitable terms. They kept saying, right, we need to get this done really quickly. You've got X number of weeks, otherwise we're just going to leave it. They knew we were desperate. Things weren't going well with the EU. Now, it was possibly always part of the plan for them not to go well with the EU. But the US trade deal was supposed to emerge this year, and that collapsed. That gave Japan an opportunity which they did not fail to take. And that's why they've got a deal that's 83% in their favour, because they knew we were desperate. They knew we needed, or specifically our Brexiteer government needed, a trade deal really quickly. That is the reality of Brexit. That is what David Frost wrote about in 2016 when he was free to be able to tell the truth, without having to toe any political line. So there we are. Hope you found the video interesting. If you did, don't forget to click the like button. If you'd like to support the channel further, please also click the Patreon link for details. And until next time, I'll see you later.